At about 1 million or so tables across the world tonight, many Jewish parents will hold their children tight and bless them with the following blessing. Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'Menashe. May God make you like Ephraim and Menashe. For the boys. And V'yisimech Elohim keSarah, Rivka, Rachel, v'Leah. May God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. For the girls. The boys' blessing, it turns out, comes from this very week's Parsha, Vayechi, in which Jacob, now named Israel, meets Joseph and blesses Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Menashe, as if they were his very own children, giving words to a blessing that would be used for countless generations to come. The interesting part is, other than this blessing, Ephraim and Menashe don't really have a whole lot of ink in the Torah. Unlike the matriarchs who represent the blessing we traditionally give girls, Ephraim and Menashe have no significant roles to play in the Torah, no journeys to follow, no lessons to learn, no adventures to share. As such, it's worthwhile asking why, out of all people in the biblical narrative, we traditionally ask God to make our boys into the likeness of two decidedly insignificant, completely ordinary biblical characters whose only appearance in the Torah occurs as a footnote to the death of our people's namesake, Israel. According to our sages, the absence of any narrative whatsoever might imply the absence of any trouble, which would make Ephraim and Menashe quite unique among the boys of Genesis. In fact, they would be the first two brothers of their family not to have any sort of violence, deceit, mistrust, or misdemeanors get in the way of good family relations. From Cain and Abel, to Isaac and Ishmael, to Jacob and Esau, to Joseph and his brothers, the entire book of Genesis is littered with boys who have issues with one another. Jacob's blessing then might represent a wish, a sage rejoinder against the sibling rivalry that had plagued his family for so long, as well as an earnest wish for peace among the two boys and their descendants. This would also be quite consistent with the blessing that we reserve for girls. After all, despite the brief rivalry between Rachel and Leah, the history of the matriarchs is certainly not one paved with the same sense of jealousy, deceit, and mistrust that mars the relationships of the men of the family. Each blessing, then, could potentially be linked to the idea that we want our children to be promoters of peace, and that is certainly a worthy blessing for this day and age. However, while the relative obscurity of Ephraim and Menashe might belie their hidden character traits, it could also be that the absence of any character traits from the biblical text is what actually makes this blessing compelling. After all, when we ask our God to make our sons like Ephraim and Menashe, what exactly does that really mean? For most of us, it probably doesn't mean much of anything, because we don't know much about Ephraim and Menashe. But that's okay, because neither does anybody else. We can attempt to infer certain character traits, like our sages did, but perhaps we're better off just leaving some questions unanswered. If the blessing is consistent with what we actually know of Ephraim and Menashe from the biblical text, then in essence, we're leaving the conversation open as to what and who our children should become. And that might not be such a bad thing. After all, do we really know what our children are going to be like 10 years from now, 30 years from now? Do we know what they'll need to be successful? What virtues, what character traits, what tools in their toolbox? Do we know the true unique gifts that they'll be able to bestow upon the world. If we're honest, we can only hope that our children will fulfill the promise of their lives and become the very best version of themselves. So if that's the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, well, maybe that's a blessing that can apply to each and every one of us, whether we're boys or girls, men or women. So as we prepare for a beginning of this new Gregorian year, may we be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Certainly may we be blessed with peace, but may we find a way to become who we were always truly meant to be. Shabbat Shalom.